more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
All right, we're here today with Rachel, who is a Christian and a professor in the School of Public Health. She does social work studies. And we're going to put to Rachel the question, is Christianity on the whole good for society? Mm-hmm. So, Rachel, what do you think? Thanks for being here, by the way. And, where do you want to go with that topic?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I do think it's good for society. I think there's a lot of elements that are good. I think you can also, I just want to do a disclaimer and say that it needs to be true Christianity and not cultural Christianity, which I think is different depending on where you are in the world. And so so I would say cultural Christianity, in the South, is buying into the Republican Party and all of that kind of stuff, which I would take issue with a lot of the things that they're about, especially right now.
Wait, you're a Christian and you don't you don't worship the Republican Party? Are you sure that you're not the cultural Christian?
I know, I'm not a cultural Christian. So
So define the other side of that. True Christian meaning true Christianity. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I would say holding true the things of the Bible and living a life after Christ, pursuing Him. And so he was about serving the most vulnerable, but even loving and spending time with those that a lot of current Christians would probably ostracize. He reached out to the prostitutes, the people that were on the fringes of society that we a lot of times look over, I think, currently. So that being said, I think that when you take his teachings as truth and right and good and pursue those kinds of things, that I think that it can transform society and create a culture that is good for everyone. So the rights of people not to be exploited, or the rights of people to seek justice, to treat the most vulnerable fairly, and those kinds of things. I think that Christianity would be right in tune, true Christianity would be in tune with those things.
So I guess true is in that sense biblical Christianity.
Biblical Christianity, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The first thing that comes to mind, and we can go a number of ways, but the first thing is that the only motivation or the primary motivation
for me,
for you, or do you think it should be for someone to follow that path? I mean, I guess, I'm thinking of a lot of friends who are not Christians, but they pursue similar, enterprises that are good for society on the whole.
Sure.
I think we would all agree. So I don't guess you would say that Christianity is the only possible motivator for,
I wouldn't say
for
that.
good works.
But I would say that for those that are Christians, and myself included, I think that Christians would agree that people are made in the image of God, and if they're made in the image of God, if everyone isn't made in the image of God, even though there might be certain things that are distorted or broken, that everyone would have a desire at their core to do that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
So you think where it's possible for a non-Christian to pursue charity, it's required for a Christian?
I think it's required for a Christian, and I think it's possible for a non-Christian because I still think they're made in God's image.
Okay.
Yeah, so that mean the explanation of why a person, even if they're an atheist, is going to do anything good is because they were built
at the
with
beginning.
at the beginning,
made in God's image.
Okay, so Rachel, it seems to me like there's a lot of big differences between the way a Christian would approach these types of the social work and so on than from the way an atheist might, even if they're both motivated by altruism to some degree. it would seem like there still should be some pretty big differences somewhere along the line, both in terms of values, goals.
Yeah.
So could you speak to maybe how it might be very different for you as a Christian to approach your social work, or anything you've seen practically, or might just surmise might be very different?
Yeah. I can speak to that. I'm trying to decide what angle to take it. I think that, for example, I see the really true kind of redemption and community transformation piece playing out more clearly in the country that I work in, because I'm collaborating with the church there, and they have I've worked with people there for a long time, and these people are the most trustworthy, genuine people that I've ever worked with. And I think that comes because of their faith in Christ and their desire to be transparent, and they're just not motivated by their own self-interest, if that makes sense. Like, they're really motivated by a desire to see Christ's name proclaimed, but recognizing that it's like a whole person change that needs to take place. And so the church has like an arm of community development and outreach and all that kind of stuff, and they really want to work with economic issues and justice issues and access to health, and they've started health clinics and all this kind of stuff. And they're not necessarily always preaching the gospel, but a lot of times that builds trust, and then they later are able to do that. Is that answering your question at all?
Yeah, so are you saying that that really their goal is to preach the gospel, and the health is sort of a means that they're providing human flourishing pathways is really a means to that? Because that would certainly be very different from, I assume, what someone who's... I don't think the goal would be for an atheist to be trying to make sure they get to hear the Bible along the way.
I would say that before they started with the more meeting social needs and health needs and all those kinds of things, they were just preaching the gospel, and they recognized that that's not going to really make a huge difference in people's today, and that people today were not thinking about eternity the way they were thinking about, how am I going to take care of my family member that has HIV, or how am I going to provide food for my children, or whatever. So it is kind of a means to an end of the gospel, but I think they also recognize that today also mattered to God. Does that make sense?
I mean, I have a question that we can jump into.
Yeah.
That is, how wouldn't people then that are there might detect that the real interest you have is in sharing with them the story of Jesus, and doesn't that wouldn't that from their perspective potentially devalue the other kinds of things people are doing?
I think that it depends on the way that it's done. If you can tell that people genuinely care about you, I think that they're so genuine that they really care about meeting those basic needs too, and that if the people that they're serving do end up getting saved, that's just an awesome bonus. Does that make sense? But they actually really want to help people combat HIV/AIDS in their society. So that's actually also the end goal.
So you think you can have both motivations, and it doesn't detract. This one about hoping people get into heaven isn't going to detract from the other kind of work you're doing.
I think the other motivation to serve them to the fullest now only provides opportunity to talk about their eternity.
Okay.
But it provides more trustworthiness, if that makes sense. There's more of a trust there if those people can tell that you love them now, and that your motivation is not necessarily that I'm going to just preach the gospel, that I'm not giving you health care because I want you to get saved, and so I can check off, I got this person saved, I got this person saved, I got this, and I can report back to my church. But I'm giving you healthy care because you need health care. And then if that leads for an opportunity to preach the gospel, then that's awesome.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Drew, are you satisfied with that answer, or do you feel like those are mutually exclusive goals?
I guess I just feel like some people would see that as being motivated by the proselytizing, even if that's not your only goal, that maybe that's the motivating factor. Yeah, I have another way that I do want to go eventually, but I don't want to derail it from this. If you want to, I think this is something that people are concerned with when they see Christians doing good things for society. It's like, well, are they just doing that so they can get the gospel in there somehow? Do you think that's a problem? Do you think that is a real problem or a perceived problem? Or I am interested in that.
I think it's probably both. I think it probably is a real problem, and it probably is also a perceived problem, because I think that a lot of times that is the ultimate goal, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. But I think if your sole motivation is just to get people saved, that even their conversion may not be genuine if it's almost like a manipulative thing. Like if it's like, well, let me tell you the gospel and then I'll give you some health care.
Right.
Then
the bread line at the mission, you have to listen to the sermon and then the old style. I don't know if that's common now, but that's been a pretty common way to do it.
But I think that's manipulative, and I think that like people that would sit through that sermon, even if they say at the end, sign me up, that they're not necessarily, that's not necessarily a transformed heart or even recognizing their need for Christ.
You strike me as pretty reasonable, so I kind of feel like we're all on the same page about this. Like there are some people with motivations that are problematic, and there are some people with motivations that are genuine, and there's everything in the middle. And honestly, at the end of the day, if they're giving away the bread and you have to listen to the sermon, well, that's better than not giving away the bread at all, I suppose. Yeah. I do think motivation plays a factor, but I kind of want to go back to, unless I don't want to derail that. If you're,
I'll add one thing. I'll add one thing to it. The command that Jesus said was the first command, the greatest command, was to love God, and he added a second one, to love your neighbor as yourself, which he said is like the first. You can't really separate them. Yeah. So for the Christian, the Christian is growing, they're learning, they're developing, they're maturing, ideally, in how to love somebody. And of course, for the Christian, that involves the whole package. It's not it's not just telling, if you were just feeding people who were starving, and that's all you ever did for them, it would be a good and noble end in itself. If you had more interaction, then you would certainly hope that at some point you were able to tell them about the story of Jesus and things like that, and that would be another way to fulfill that command. There's no question for the Christian which one's the priority, but at the same time, at the same time, that you can keep both in view and you can grow in that. And of course, some people are just going to simply, just like in any other sphere of living, human beings are going to be immature in their thinking, or they're not going to understand certain things. So it's not surprising that there's a real problem of people just sort of trying to shove the story of Jesus down people's throat. And yet there's also a perceived problem where people who aren't Christians latch on to those bad examples and discard the people who clearly in their life, over many years, don't demonstrate that the only way they care for somebody is just to tell them the story of Jesus.
I'll grant that. I think that that definitely there's some latching on to the worst examples, but it is a sensible reading, I think, for a Christian to say, well, if I'm going to love God and then the second commandment is to love others, then I'm going to put God's interests first, and maybe that's evangelism, and then the physical needs second. I mean, I'm not saying, obviously I don't agree with that. I think that can seem very disingenuous. I think that's why people have a problem with it. But again, I think we're kind of all on the same page that there's a good way and a bad way to do it, and there's a middle ground, and there's, am I offended by the fact that someone would do good works and then try to slip the Christian message in there. It's not the biggest problem in the world. I do think that you got to be, like honest about it.
Yeah, I think some transparency.
Just upfront, transparent. Yeah.
Don't you think that everyone, whether you're a Christian or not, like I get the impression that most people have some kind of message.
They have some kind of motive.
I feel like a lot of people's, humanitarian works sort of are their own goal, and maybe there's pride involved. There's some, they see themselves as doing good, which of course we all want to see ourselves that way. But this is a little different. Wouldn't you say that if there's a message that you're really wanting to get out, and you're doing the works as a conduit for getting that message out, that's a little different than just taking pride in the works themselves.
Yeah. But I want to go back to something you said earlier. You said something about how some Christians would say, love God is number one, and love people would be number two.
Well, just
and
the
number one.
commandments that Bill was talking about, love the Lord with all your heart and soul, and then love your neighbor as yourself. Some people would see that as a hierarchy. Number one, love God. Number two, love others. And if they do see it that way, I could see them, prioritizing that way and saying, well, if I love God,
then I
want to spread His message, and
Yeah.
I want to, pursue His ends in the world, and maybe that's primarily evangelism. Maybe it's not. But,
Yeah, it's not quite what I meant. I meant that he said the second one is like unto the first, meaning you can't separate them, and loving your neighbor is a way of loving God, not that it's...
So your reading would be the opposite of what I'm saying. I'm just saying, I do see how a person could interpret it that way. And that actually brings me, if I don't want to cut you off.
No, you're good.
Okay, but that actually brings me to my big question, which I'd like to spend a little time on, and that is, Rachel, are you just reading the Bible in the way that makes sense to you, an altruistic, serving person, and the Rush Limbaugh Christian is reading the Bible in a way that makes sense to them, a selfish and miserly person? That's a pretty... Obviously, I'm saying that in a tongue-in-cheek way, but I do honestly think that, if you're not predisposed to altruism, humanitarianism, public service, whatever you want to call it, you're typically not going to read the Bible that way. You're going to say, okay, well, Jesus did some of these things, but He was also God, and blah, 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 and, we don't get a lot of exhortation to serve in certain places, so we're going to focus on these places, and this sort of self-disciplined Christianity, this sort of sort of monkish, spend time on yourself and your prayer time and your singing to God and whatever it may be, and like that's the kind of Christianity you're going to focus on because everything is inward. So my real question, not tongue-in-cheek, is, is it really...
And being self-disciplined so you can get rich?
Well, of course, yeah.
Follow the biblical economic scheme so you can
make a lot of money.
Be affluent and...
Yeah, without calling anybody out that I might have mentioned in the last couple minutes, obviously there's some charlatans just in general, but no, the real question is it really that you just take the Bible at face value, take Orthodox Christianity at face value, and from that you take out, I've got to serve the poor, serve the world, be a person that's acting in the interest of the public? Or is it just that you're so motivated and so that's how you read, the Bible? Because...
Meaning, is it skewing her reading of the New Testament or of the Bible?
I mean, my card's on the table. I think you're just a good person and you're reading the Bible that way. And, it's convenient. But and it does motivate you. I don't doubt that. I do think...
Drew's question is an accusation.
Well, it's an accusation in the best way.
It is indeed. All right.
I just think that, a lot of times, we can interpret things how we want them, and that can still be very motivating, but is it really what's there? And that's what I want to get into. And I'm not expecting you to be a Bible scholar, but I want to see how
I'm not a Bible scholar, but I do think that's really what's there. And I think that what's happened in our culture is that we've let culture come before what the Bible actually says. And we're interpreting the Bible based on our individualistic, selfish worldview that's putting America first and thinking America's Israel and all of this kind of stuff, when we're not reading the Bible with like the context in mind, or how this could translate to now, how it might be different from then. And I think that we need to be reading the Bible first and then thinking about how that applies to our culture, instead of reading it through our cultural lens. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So
go ahead.
obviously, the things you're involved in, there's actually some of that is popular. Some of the work you're doing is popular. On the sort of social justice type things are actually, there's a real sort of jet stream of energy behind that right now.
Yeah.
So couldn't that be just simply one of those things that's just sort of the culture of today, and it isn't really? I'm asking from Drew's perspective, to be clear, not my own.
No, I mean, I'm thinking back to like my life and how, because I grew up in a home that was very much like, have your quiet time, spend time with God, and I think that's great. Like, I'm not saying that was a bad upbringing; it was a great upbringing. But I think that we missed out on the more full picture of what the Bible speaks to in terms of like social justice issues. And I don't think that you can take evangelism or like the just the desire to see people saved and cut off the social justice component. Like, I think they have to go hand in hand. I also don't think you should only do social justice and cut off the like in desire to see people saved. Like, I think you really need them both if you're going to get a full picture of the gospel.
And I guess my only pushback is just that you see a lot of that, and you don't just see it from good families or bad families. You don't see that from certain types of churches or certain denominations. You see a lot of pastors in the pulpit and leaders in the church saying, we need to focus inwardly. We need to, and then you see some others saying, well, no, we need to focus outwardly. We're missions oriented, or we're, whatever the case may be. And I'm just here to ask, what, is it just the preconceptions of these people that they're coming in with? Is that the difference? Or are they really seeing something different in the Bible? Because, honestly, I've read it, and I feel like it's not particularly clear sometimes where it's going. The Old Testament is, pretty dense and hard to, read prescriptionally.
Yeah.
and so you have to, at some point, sort of pick where you're going to focus and say, well, I like this Jesus guy, he seems to be a pretty central figure. Maybe we should do like he did.
Well, I mean, that's quite a way to characterize Christianity, Drew. I mean, Jesus
I think that's a fairly accurate way to. But I'm just saying that.
He's not a pretty central figure.
Yeah,
he's the central
from the Christian perspective, right? He's obviously.
And I'm saying that it's funny though, because how many Christians do that?
Well, if I may say, to your point about just reading, say, we can't cover the whole Bible or whatever, but if we just take the Gospels, I mean, to her point, it's by and large, it's story after story of Jesus encountering people who were disadvantaged, oppressed, broken in spiritual, psychological, emotional, moral, intellectual ways, some of whom had money, some of whom didn't. Most of them were not affluent, but some were. And he spoke to people who were affluent as well, and wasn't sort of prejudicial against them as far as I read it. So in other words, the story of his ministry is when people wanted to follow him, he said things like, "Well, do you realize that I don't have that a fox has a hole to live in? I don't have anywhere to live. That there's a place for people to I don't have a place to lay my head. Are you prepared to just sort of live this way?" So meaning he's literally traveling around Israel and people are following him.
And I guess I would just put back that certainly he was not a seeker of material gains or a inwardly focused guy, but by the same token, he wasn't, going and feeding the poor, as a practice, as a ministry. He was teaching, and he was teaching about how you should live, and not necessarily teaching or not necessarily serving as an example. There were, of course, the miracles where he, healed people and things.
I was going to say he did obviously feed the multitudes.
5,000 people.
Well, there are actually 2 incidents where he fed multiple people that were hungry. So
But we're talking about science.
you're right
We're
that
talking
his
about-
whole focus wasn't just on feeding people. He taught, which
I'm just saying, in 3 years of ministry, you don't see too much where he goes into a village and he feeds, all the children, or he works,
Well, healing people. I don't really see that because if you're healing people who are paralyzed or blind or deaf, I would think that's even better than just feeding the poor. So.
I get the impression that the majority of the time was spent talking, teaching, and if an opportunity came up for him to show a sign as a miracle, he would do that. Not always, but usually, and that's all fine. But like the focus of the ministry was teaching.
I think it was both. I think he taught people, but then he also demonstrated that he cared about their whole lives when he healed them, when he gave them food, when he spoke truth into their lives. And also, like, there are times when he tells stories about people that are cast into fire, and they're like, but we knew you. And he's like, yeah, but when I was hungry, you didn't give me a drink. You didn't give me food. Or when I was thirsty, you didn't give me a drink. And so, like, you really didn't know me. And so I think that's why I think that both of those have to go together.
I do think maybe Drew has a point about something that he mentioned earlier, which is that I think he's right that, or I think he may be right. I have to flesh this out now as we're talking about it. That obviously for what I mean is obviously if someone had cancer, here's your illustration. Someone has cancer, and they have cancer, but they also mentioned before you're an MRI tech or a CAT scan person that they were really hungry. Well, yeah, you could bring them a sandwich, but the news about their condition of cancer is way more serious than the issue about them being hungry. So I don't think that we can get away from that from our perspective as Christians, there's no disputing that taking the New Testament and the Gospels, in particular the ministry of Jesus, that the priority is on what's on the inside of a person, that their soul, which involves everything, their intellect, morality, and so on.
Their soul matters.
All of that is more important than the body. That's definitely a pattern across the Gospels. I think you're right about if that was your point. And I don't think that you can get away from that. However much you're doing to tend to people's various needs, that bigger issue of their relationship with God would be viewed as the priority issue.
Yeah.
So, so maybe I guess I'm saying I sort of agree with you, even though I didn't agree with your characterization of it exactly. But I think I do agree with you about that priority. But the question is whether loving someone means that you rudely make them sit and listen to you tell this story of Jesus because you have some ability where they have to listen to you because you're providing medicine or something like that.
Yeah, like
that
power over them.
Yeah, that would seem to me to be then contrary to his ministry and the way he approached it. But.
Well, sure, but yeah, I think my real question is just about the motivation, which is just, are you motivated? It's kind of like, motivations for other things that a lot of people would say, well, I do this because I believe that's what the Bible teaches.
Mm-hmm.
And even within Christians, I'm struggling for a really good example, but even within Christian churches and Christian circles, people debate, well, is this really what the Bible teaches? Take an issue. Abortion's probably a little too incendiary. Maybe the homosexual rights or
birth control,
or marriage,
vaccination.
Well, I think
it's become a real hot topic.
I think gay marriage is an interesting one because there are Christian churches that have supported that, and there are some that aren't. Maybe you can argue about who's reading the Bible correctly. And I think you can really with this issue too. I think it's a matter of, this is your reading. You think it's correct, and it inspires you, and it's an impetus for you to do what you do. I think it's, maybe this is where the divide is. I honestly don't think that it's that cut and dry. I think I like it when people read the Bible that way.
Yeah, sure.
If you're going to read the Bible and be inspired by it, I want you to be inspired by the things that are good for society.
Yeah, seeking good for people.
I'm sympathetic to the Christian who reads the Bible and doesn't get that message, because I just don't think it's as in your face as I'd like it to be if I wrote the Bible.
I mean, I would just say that, like, when I was in college, that's when I really started seeing that the full redemption side, the full redemption piece, like the not just eternity, but eternity starts now idea. The concept of it's like really it was the issue of seeking justice and serving the most vulnerable that, like, beforehand I had never really thought of. Like, I'd thought about mission work. I love different cultures. I was inspired by missionaries, and they were probably a big impact on my life, but I never thought about the social side of that at all until I was a sophomore in college, and it was literally I can remember exactly where I was sitting, where I was reading my Bible, and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much here in the Psalms about God seeking justice for people, and that he would do that, but that we should also be doing that, and the people that are the ones that do that are the people that are on God's side, basically. And that's when I started thinking the salvation thing, this wasn't just a fire insurance, as you put it earlier, but this is a whole transformed life.
It starts now.
Yeah.
Just a couple of minutes.
So I agree about the divide as well. That that in a sense the real issue isn't so much. You're totally happy, of course, with anyone doing the kind of work she's doing, Rachel's doing, but also that for me and for her, it seems fairly obvious. Even though you're just listening to her story, she's reading the Bible, saying, "Oh, not even just in the Gospels. This is a calling I have," and we would see it as sort of like you're growing and you're maturing in your reading of it, and you're saying, "Yeah, I don't know. It could be kind of go both ways," and I guess that's where the divide is.
I think that's right.
All right, Rachel, thank you so
Yeah.
much for coming. Really nice to be
Pleasure.
here.
Enjoyed it.
With you, and I am Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew, the skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, The Divide by iPub. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.